Hey guys, tonight we're tiptoeing into the often awkward, sometimes hilarious, and occasionally terrifying world of historical party fouls and social misfits. Imagine you've just laid out your finest Roman dormice, or your most exquisite, medieval peacock pie. The lute player is in tune, the wine is flowing, and then he walks in. That one guest destined to curdle the cream, silence the laughter, and generally kill the vibe with the efficiency of a well-aimed catapult. We're about to discover why some ancient and historical figures, particularly those famously stoic Spartans, were surprisingly bad at parties, and explore a whole host of other social calamities from bygone eras. Frankly, with some of these historical party poopers, you probably wouldn't survive an evening's entertainment without developing a deep appreciation for a quiet night in with a good scroll. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone's drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You know the feeling, don't you? That subtle, sinking sensation when a particular individual enters a gathering and the collective energy in the room seems to dip. The laughter becomes a little more strained, the conversation a touch more stilted. It's the timeless terror of the bad party guest, a social phenomenon that has likely plagued hosts and hostesses since the first cave dweller invited his neighbors over for a haunch of freshly hunted and perhaps slightly undercooked mammoth. But what makes a truly memorable, historically awful party guest? Is it a lack of social grace? An inability to engage in polite conversation? A penchant for saying precisely the wrong thing at precisely the wrong moment? Or perhaps it's a more fundamental misalignment, a worldview so profoundly out of sync with the spirit of conviviality that their very presence casts a pall over the proceedings. Tonight, our sleepy sociological survey begins with a group renowned for their military prowess, their discipline, their austerity, but decidedly not for their party animal tendencies, the ancient Spartans. We'll be journeying to their stark, formidable homeland in Laconia, a place where life was less about feasting and frivolity and more about forging unbreakable warriors. And as we delve into their unique culture, you might begin to understand why inviting a Spartan to your next symposium or dinner party might have been a recipe for a rather subdued affair. But our exploration won't end there. Oh no, the Spartans, while perhaps champions of vibe killing, were certainly not alone. In the annals of awkward social encounters, we'll gently meander through history, peeking into Roman conviviums where famously stern senators might have glowered at the wine cups, and Puritan potlucks where mirth itself was often viewed with deep suspicion. We'll consider royal courts, where the king's bad mood or political paranoia could turn a feast into a very tense and joyless obligation. We'll even touch upon the epic social misunderstandings that could arise when different cultures, with their vastly different ideas of hospitality and celebration, collided. And what about those guests who weren't even strictly human, or at least not entirely welcome? From professional party crashers in ancient Greece to demanding deities who had a habit of inviting themselves and expecting the best seat, antiquity had its share of truly unwanted attendees who could ruin an otherwise perfectly good gathering. We'll also explore the less glamorous side of historical feasting, from the forced jollity of medieval minstrels to the profoundly unfestive, silent suppers within monastery walls. This wide-ranging look at social awkwardness and bad guests across various cultures is a mainstream approach in social history, examining how different societies defined and dealt with breaches of expected convivial behavior. As a gentle contrast, lest you think all ancient gatherings were doomed to awkwardness, we'll even take a peek into an Athenian symposium, a lively scene of philosophy, poetry, and wine-fueled debate, to see what the Spartans, and perhaps some of our other historical party poopers, were missing out on. Why do these tales of centuries-old social clumsiness, these accounts of historical party fouls, still bring a faint, sleepy smile to our faces? Perhaps it's because they remind us of our own occasional social anxieties, our own experiences with awkward silences or vibe-killing guests. Or maybe it's just a comforting reminder that even the most formidable historical figures, the fierce warriors, the stern lawmakers, the pious reformers, were still, at the end of the day, human beings capable of being profoundly, and sometimes hilariously, out of place at a party. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of ancient hosting might involve the specific rituals or charms employed to ensure a successful and harmonious gathering, or to ward off ill-omened guests or disruptive influences. The precise nature of such party protection, rituals would vary, but the underlying anxiety about a social event going wrong seems to be a constant. The extent to which hosts actively tried to vet their guest lists for potential vibe killers in antiquity is a fascinating, if difficult to document, area of social historical speculation. So, prepare to send out your anachronistic party invitations. We're about to embark on a sleepy soiree through the ages, encountering some of history's most legendarily awkward attendees and pondering the timeless art of killing the mood. Don't worry, you're a welcome guest here. Just try not to spill your imaginary mead. The general, timeless terror of that awkward party guest, the one destined to bring a chill to any convivial gathering, now begins to focus on a very specific and rather formidable group, the ancient Spartans. Before we fully dissect their potential for party pooping, let's first gently immerse ourselves in their unique and often unforgiving world. Journey with me now to the stark, sun-baked plains of Laconia in the Peloponnese, to the city-state of Sparta, or Lacedaemon as it was also known. This was a society that famously valued iron will, military discipline, and a laconic, a word derived from Laconia itself, brevity of speech far more than it prized witty repartee, elaborate feasts, or the delicate art of mixing a crater of spiced wine. Just so, imagine a city unlike any other in ancient Greece. While Athens was adorned with magnificent marble temples, theatres, and bustling marketplaces, Sparta, for much of its classical period, presented a far more austere, almost utilitarian face to the world. Thucydides, the great Athenian historian, famously remarked that if Sparta were ever deserted and only its temples and foundations remained, future generations would scarcely believe its power, so modest were its public buildings compared to its reputation. This outward simplicity was a deliberate reflection of Spartan values, a disdain for luxury, a focus on communal good over individual display, and an all-consuming dedication to military readiness. This contrast between Sparta's military might and its unadorned capital is a mainstream historical observation. Life in Sparta was rigidly controlled from birth. Every newborn Spartan infant was reportedly inspected by the elders of their tribe. If the child was deemed weak, sickly, or deformed, it was said to be exposed on the slopes of Mount Tegetos to die, a brutal form of state-enforced eugenics designed to ensure the physical strength and perfection of the citizen body. Those who passed this initial test were destined for a life of service to the state, a life that began its most rigorous phase at a very young age. The society was divided into distinct classes. At the top were the Spartiates, the full citizens, a relatively small warrior elite who dedicated their lives to military training and service. They were forbidden to engage in agriculture or trade, these tasks being relegated to other groups. Below them were the perioikoi, dwellers around, free non-citizens who lived in the surrounding towns and villages, engaged in commerce and crafts, and served as auxiliaries in the Spartan army. At the very bottom were the helots, a large population of state-owned serfs or slaves tied to the land they worked, primarily in Messenia, and living in a state of constant subjugation. The Spartiates lived in perpetual fear of a helot uprising, and this fear profoundly shaped their militaristic culture and their brutal treatment of the helot population, including an annual ritualistic declaration of war against them, allowing young Spartans to kill helots without religious pollution. The political system of Sparta was also unique, a mixture of monarchy. They had two hereditary kings simultaneously from different families. Oligarchy, the Gerousia, a council of elders, held considerable power, and a form of limited democracy, the appella, an assembly of all adult male. Spartiates could vote on proposals, though often only by shouting. This complex mixed constitution was a source of fascination and sometimes admiration for other Greek thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, though its precise workings and the true balance of power within it are still subjects of scholarly debate. Daily, life for a Spartiate male was centered around military preparedness. From the age of 7, as you'll explore more soon, boys were removed from their families to undergo the Agoge, a brutal state-run training program. Even adult men lived a communal life, eating their meals together in common messes, the Syssitia, rather than with their own families. This was designed to foster loyalty, discipline, and a sense of brotherhood among the warriors. Women in Sparta, while not citizens in the political sense, enjoyed a relatively higher status and greater freedom than women in many other Greek city-states, including Athens. They were expected to be physically fit, to bear strong children for the state, and to manage the households and estates while the men were engaged in military duties. They received education, participated in athletic competitions, and could own and inherit property. However, their lives too were ultimately dedicated to the service of the Spartan state. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of Spartan life was their use of iron spits or rods, oboloi, as currency for a long period, as mentioned by Plutarch. These were deliberately cumbersome and of little intrinsic value, supposedly designed by the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus to discourage the accumulation of wealth, prevent bribery, and limit foreign trade that might introduce corrupting luxuries. Imagine trying to buy a loaf of bread with a handful of heavy iron bars. It certainly wasn't conducive to impulse shopping. So, as you immerse yourself in this world of stark discipline, military obsession, communal living, and a profound suspicion of luxury and individualism, you begin to get a sense of the Spartan character. It's a character forged in a crucible of constant vigilance, austerity, and unwavering devotion to the state. It's a character that prized endurance over eloquence, obedience over originality, and the collective good over personal pleasure. Now picture this individual, this product of Laconian steel, being invited to a lively Athenian dinner party, with its philosophical discussions, its poetic recitations, its flute girls, and its flowing wine. The potential for a spectacular clash of cultures and a truly awkward evening seems almost inevitable, doesn't it? The stark, disciplined landscape of Sparta, with its iron currency and ever-watchful helot population, now sharpens its focus on the very making of a Spartan citizen. Before you can truly appreciate why a Spartan might have been a challenging party guest, you need to understand the relentless, all-encompassing upbringing that shaped them from their earliest years. You are now delving into the infamous Agoge, the rigorous Spartan state-run education and training system, a brutal crucible, where children learned to endure hardship, obey without question, speak with laconic brevity, and fight with unwavering ferocity. It was a system designed to forge the ultimate warrior, but perhaps, in the process, it conveniently skipped a few crucial lessons on small talk, social graces, and the subtle art of not making everyone else at the banquet feel deeply uncomfortable. Imagine a 7-year-old Spartan boy, deemed fit by the elders at birth, being taken from his family home. This wasn't a gentle transition to a local school. It was an abrupt immersion into a communal, quasi-military existence that would define the next 2 decades of his life, and arguably his entire worldview. He would join a troop, or herd, agel, of other boys his age, living in barracks under the strict supervision of older youths and state-appointed magistrates. This separation from the family unit and absorption into an age-based peer group was a fundamental aspect of the Agoge, designed to break down familial loyalties and instill an absolute devotion to the Spartan state and his fellow warriors. This early separation and communal upbringing is a mainstream historical fact central to understanding Spartan society. The training was, by all accounts, incredibly harsh, a relentless regime of physical exercise, deprivation, and discipline. The boys were deliberately underfed, their daily rations meager and unappetizing. This wasn't just about austerity. It was intended to make them resourceful, encouraging them to steal food to supplement their diet. However, there was a catch. If they were caught stealing, they were severely punished, not for the theft itself, but for their clumsiness and lack of cunning in getting caught. This peculiar moral lesson, that stealth and ingenuity in wrongdoing were admirable, while getting caught was shameful, is one of the more eyebrow-raising aspects of Spartan education. They went barefoot year-round, regardless of the weather, to toughen their feet. They were given only one garment of clothing per year, a simple woolen cloak, forcing them to endure the cold. They slept on beds they made themselves from reeds gathered from the Eurotas River without the comfort of blankets. All of this was designed to build physical resilience, to make them impervious to hardship, to ensure they could endure the rigors of a hoplite campaign without complaint. Physical training was, of course, paramount. Running, jumping, wrestling, javelin throwing, discus, and various forms of weapons training would fill their days. They engaged in mock battles, sometimes reportedly with a level of violence that could lead to serious injury or even death, all to instill courage and ferocity. The emphasis was not just on individual skill, but on coordinated group action, the discipline required for the phalanx, the backbone of Spartan military success. Intellectual education, as valued in Athens, was given far less importance. While Spartans were not necessarily illiterate, they needed to understand commands and perhaps read basic messages. The focus was not on philosophy, rhetoric, or the fine arts. Instead, they were taught Spartan lore and tradition, patriotic songs and poems celebrating martial valor, and above all, obedience to authority. They were trained to speak with that famous laconic brevity, concisely to the point, often with a dry, cutting wit. Long-winded speeches were despised. A Spartan was expected to listen more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words were to be few and weighty. Discipline was maintained through constant supervision and frequent, often brutal, corporal punishment. Older boys in the Agoge were given authority over younger ones and were encouraged to be harsh enforcers of the rules. Flogging was a common punishment for any infraction, designed not just to inflict pain, but also to test endurance and reinforce obedience. The annual festival of Artemis Orthia, where young Spartan boys were reportedly flogged, sometimes to the point of death, before the altar of the goddess, is a particularly notorious example of this emphasis on ritualized endurance of pain, though the exact nature and purpose of this ritual are still debated by scholars. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of the Agoge might have involved specific training in music and dance, but not for artistic expression or entertainment in the Athenian sense. Spartan music was typically martial and Dorian in mode, used to instill discipline and coordinate movement in battle. Their dances, like the Purish, a war dance, were athletic and militaristic, rehearsals for combat. So, while they had music and dance, it was all subservient to the overarching military purpose. This relentless focus on military preparedness, on physical hardship, on unquestioning obedience, and on laconic speech continued until a Spartan male reached the age of 20 when he became a full soldier. Even then, he would continue to live in the barracks and eat in the common mess until the age of 30. It was a system designed to produce a very specific type of individual: tough, disciplined, brave, loyal to his comrades and the state, and utterly unconcerned with personal comfort or intellectual fripperies. So, as you imagine this product of the Agoge, this perfectly honed fighting machine, suddenly thrust into a social situation requiring charm, elaborate conversation, an appreciation for fine food and wine, or a participation in light-hearted party games, you can begin to see the potential for a significant disconnect. The skills that made him a superlative soldier were precisely the skills that might make him a truly terrible party guest. The Agoge trained for battle, not banquets, and the lessons on how to gracefully decline a second helping of peacock, or how to make polite chit-chat with a philosopher, seem to have been conspicuously absent from the curriculum. The echoes of that brutal Spartan training regime, the Agoge, with its emphasis on hardship, obedience, and laconic speech, still resonate as you now find yourself invited, or perhaps more accurately, obligated, to join your Spartan comrades for their daily communal meal. Forget any notions of a lively banquet, a relaxed dinner party, or even a boisterous tavern feast. You are about to pull up a rough-hewn wooden bench at the Spartan Syssitia, plural Syssitia, a dining club or common mess that was a cornerstone of Spartiate life. And you'd quickly discover that these daily gatherings were far more akin to a disciplined military mess hall than a festival of fun, focused on basic sustenance, reinforcing group solidarity, and maintaining that famous Spartan austerity, with very little room for what the rest of the Greek world might consider enjoyable dining or light-hearted social mingling. Imagine a plain, unadorned hall, perhaps part of the barracks where adult Spartan warriors lived until the age of 30, or a designated communal building. There are no elaborate decorations, no comfortable couches to recline upon, as in an Athenian symposium. Instead, you find simple wooden tables and benches. The atmosphere is not one of relaxed conviviality, but of disciplined order. Each Syssitian consisted of a small group, typically around 15 men, who messed together for life. Membership was by election, and a single negative vote could exclude a candidate, making acceptance into a good mess a matter of considerable social importance. This elective nature of the mess groups and the lifelong commitment to them is a mainstream historical fact highlighting the intense group cohesion valued by Spartans. The food itself was famously, almost legendarily, plain and meagre. The most notorious dish, the one that sent shivers of disgust down the spines of other Greeks who were unfortunate enough to sample it, was the melazomos, or black broth. Its ingredients reportedly included pork, salt, vinegar, and pig's blood. It sounds, and by all contemporary accounts, tasted absolutely dreadful. One story tells of a Sybarite, a citizen of Sybaris, a Greek city renowned for its luxury, who, after tasting Spartan black broth, declared that he now understood why Spartans were so fearless in battle, as death itself would be preferable to such a diet. While perhaps an exaggeration, it captures the general sentiment. This black broth was the staple, supplemented by barley bread, a small amount of wine, usually diluted with water, and occasionally some cheese, figs, or a little game if a member had been successful in hunting. Each member of the Syssitian was required to contribute a fixed monthly quota of provisions from the produce of their helot-worked estate. Barley meal, wine, cheese, figs, and a small sum of money for the purchase of meat or fish. Failure to make these contributions could lead to a loss of citizenship rights, a severe penalty that underscored the importance of this communal duty. The system was designed to ensure a basic equality in sustenance among all Spartiates, preventing any individual from displaying wealth through lavish private dining. Conversation at the Syssitian, if it occurred, was likely to be as sparse and to the point as Spartan speech in general. This was not a place for idle chatter, philosophical debate, or witty banter. The focus was on reinforcing military values, discussing matters of state, perhaps with older, more experienced members guiding the conversation, and maintaining discipline. Young boys, even those still in the Agoge, were sometimes allowed to attend the Syssitia as observers, to learn from their elders, but they were expected to remain silent and absorb the lessons of austerity and obedience. Jokes, if any, were likely of the dry, laconic Spartan variety, often at the expense of outsiders, or those who displayed weakness or a lack of discipline. Plutarch recounts stories of older Spartans testing the younger men with pointed questions or riddles at the mess, expecting quick, clever, and above all, brief answers. Failure to respond appropriately could result in a pinch or a bite on the thumb, a rather direct form of Socratic method. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of the Syssitian might have been the sharing of the cup. While wine was consumed, it was likely done so in moderation, and perhaps from a common cup passed around, further emphasizing the communal nature of the meal and discouraging individual overindulgence. Drunkenness was despised in Sparta, seen as a sign of weakness and lack of self-control. They even reportedly forced helots to become intoxicated and then paraded them before the young Spartans, as a negative example of the effects of excessive alcohol. The precise rituals and etiquette within the Syssitia, beyond the general austerity, are not always fully detailed in ancient sources, leaving room for some scholarly interpretation about the exact atmosphere and interactions. So, as you sit on that hard wooden bench, dutifully consuming your portion of unappetizing black broth and coarse barley bread, surrounded by silent, stern-faced warriors, you realize that this is no party. There are no flute girls, no poetic recitations, no philosophical musings on the nature of the good. This is a ritual of a different kind, a daily reaffirmation of Spartan identity, a reinforcement of communal bonds forged in hardship, a practical exercise in austerity and discipline. It was designed to make men tough, to make them reliant on each other, to strip away any pretensions of individual luxury or comfort. It was, in essence, an extension of the Agoge into adult life. And while it undoubtedly contributed to Sparta's formidable military strength, it also helps explain why a Spartan, accustomed to this Spartan, pun very much intended form of soirée, might find the more relaxed, indulgent, and talkative gatherings of other cultures profoundly alien, and, perhaps, deeply unappealing. The Syssitia was more mess hall than mingle, and it perfectly prepared its members for the battlefield, but not perhaps for the buffet table. The stark, unappetizing atmosphere of the Spartan Syssitia, with its black broth and laconic warriors, now provides the perfect, if somewhat grim, backdrop for imagining what might happen when one of these highly disciplined, socially unconventional individuals ventured beyond the borders of Laconia. Picture this: a stoic Spartan envoy, perhaps dispatched on a diplomatic mission to a more cosmopolitan and luxury-loving city like Athens or Corinth, finds himself an unwilling guest at a lavish symposium or a sophisticated dinner party. You can almost feel the palpable awkwardness as he tries to navigate the alien world of witty banter, philosophical debate, elaborate food, and general frivolity with the grim determination and social finesse of a heavily armed hoplite facing a surprise Persian cavalry charge. The potential for hilarious, if deeply uncomfortable social calamities is immense. Imagine your Spartan, let's call him Lycurgus Jr., no relation probably, arriving at an Athenian symposium. The room is filled with couches upon which elegantly robed Athenians recline, garlands of flowers on their heads, wine cups, beautifully painted kylixes in hand. The air is alive with clever conversation, poetic recitations, the music of a flute girl, and perhaps even the slightly risque antics of hired entertainers. Lycurgus Jr., accustomed to hard benches, minimal conversation, and a single garment, stands out like a particularly severe block of granite in a flower garden. He likely refuses the garland, finding it frivolous. He sits stiffly upright, an island of iron discipline in a sea of relaxed indulgence. When offered a cup of wine, meticulously mixed with water in a large crater by the host, for drinking undiluted. Wine was considered barbaric by most Greeks, though Spartan habits in this regard are sometimes debated. He might eye it with suspicion. Is this the watered-down stuff they drink in the Syssitia, or some dangerously potent, luxury-addled concoction designed to loosen tongues and morals? If he does drink, he probably does so sparingly, without engaging in the customary toasts or witty remarks. This scene, the stoic Spartan envoy in a lively Athenian symposium, is a classic trope often hinted at or described in ancient literature, highlighting the cultural chasm between the two city-states. The Athenians, for their part, would likely be both fascinated and appalled by his austerity, perhaps attempting to draw him out with leading questions, or more likely, making sly jokes at his expense once his back was turned, or even to his face, depending on their level of inebriation and courage. The conversation flows around him, a torrent of philosophical speculation, political gossip, literary criticism, and ribald humour. Lycurgus Jr., trained to speak only when necessary, and then with utmost brevity, remains largely silent. When directly addressed, he might offer a curt, single-word answer that effectively kills the conversational thread stone dead. Tell us, Laconian, what think you of Alcibiades' latest proposal? Might be met with a grunt, or perhaps a terse unwise. His famous Spartan brevity, so admired at home, comes across here as boorish, uncooperative, or simply baffling. Then comes the food. Instead of black broth and barley bread, he's presented with an array of delicacies: roasted thrushes, eels in beet sauce, honey cakes, exotic fruits. He likely eats little, perhaps viewing such an elaborate spread as a sign of decadence and moral weakness. He certainly wouldn't be exclaiming over the chef's skill or asking for the recipe for the fig conserve. His disdain for luxury, a core Spartan virtue, would be palpable, casting a subtle chill over the host's carefully planned menu. The mainstream historical fact of Spartan austerity and their documented suspicion of foreign luxuries would make them particularly challenging dinner guests in more opulent settings. And the entertainment? The flute girl's lilting melodies, the dancer's graceful movements, the poet's stirring verses, all might be met with a stony, unimpressed gaze from Lycurgus Jr. If it's not a martial war dance or a patriotic hymn designed to inspire courage for battle, what's the point? He might even openly scorn such frivolous displays as unmanly and a waste of time, much to the discomfort of the other guests and the performers themselves. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of Spartan interactions abroad might involve their reaction to humour that wasn't of the dry, sardonic, laconian variety. The more playful, witty, or even slapstick humour common in Athenian comedies or symposia might simply fly over their heads, or worse, be seen as undignified. Imagine trying to tell a knock-knock joke to a Spartan. The blank stare would be utterly deflating. The precise nature of Spartan humour, beyond its famed brevity and occasional bite, is difficult to fully reconstruct, but it seems unlikely to have meshed well with more exuberant forms of Greek comedy. So, our Spartan envoy, adrift in a sea of Athenian sophistication and self-indulgence, becomes the ultimate party pooper, not necessarily through malice, but through a profound cultural incompatibility. His virtues at home, discipline, austerity, brevity, unwavering seriousness, become social liabilities abroad. He doesn't understand the rules of this particular game, and frankly, he probably doesn't care to learn them. He is a warrior, a hoplite, trained to face down enemies on the battlefield, not to engage in philosophical repartee or appreciate the finer points of a well-spiced sauce. As the symposium wears on, and the other guests become increasingly lubricated with wine and good cheer, Lycurgus Jr. likely remains a solitary, sober monument to Laconian rectitude, perhaps silently judging the decadence around him, or simply longing for the familiar discomfort of his hard bench and his bowl of black broth. His presence, however, unintentionally serves as a constant, if silent, rebuke to the entire affair, making everyone else feel just a little bit self-conscious, a little less joyful. He hasn't said much, he hasn't done much, but he has, in his own uniquely Spartan way, managed to kill the vibe with an efficiency that would make any professional party crasher envious. The image of that stoic Spartan envoy, Lycurgus Jr., casting a pall over the lavish Athenian symposium with his mere presence, now leads us to a more precise, if still gently speculative, definition. What exactly was it about the Spartan character, forged in the crucible of the Agoge and the austerity of the Syssitia, that made them such legendarily awkward, even terrible party guests? Was it simply their famous laconic speech, leaving conversational gaps wider than the Eurotaz River? Was it their ingrained disdain for luxury, making them silently, or not so silently, judge every gilded goblet and spiced delicacy? Or was it a more fundamental inability to appreciate, or even comprehend, the very concept of light-hearted frivolity, the playful tunes of a flute girl, or the subtle joys of a well-mixed crater of wine? Let's try to dissect the elements of Spartan badness when it came to social gatherings outside their own very specific, very disciplined context. Firstly, that famous Spartan brevity, their laconic mode of speech, while perhaps efficient in a military council or a terse exchange, on the battlefield would be a significant social handicap at any gathering that valued conversation and witty exchange. Imagine trying to engage a Spartan in polite small talk. "Lovely weather we're having, wouldn't you say, Demaratos?" Might be met with a grunt or a single unadorned yes. Or perhaps, even more disconcertingly, "It is weather." End of conversation. This wasn't necessarily rudeness in their eyes. It was simply how they were trained to communicate, directly, without unnecessary embellishment. But to an Athenian or a Corinthian accustomed to elaborate rhetorical flourishes and philosophical debates that could last for hours, such stark minimalism would seem uncooperative, unfriendly, or just plain dull. The ability to contribute to a flowing, engaging conversation is, after all, a key attribute of a good party guest. Then there was their deeply ingrained disdain for luxury and material comfort. This wasn't just a personal preference. It was a core tenet of their state ideology, a virtue instilled from birth. So, when confronted with the opulence of other Greek city-states, the fine food, the expensive wines, the comfortable furnishings, the elaborate decorations, the perfumed oils, a Spartan's reaction was likely to be one of suspicion, contempt, or at best, utter indifference. They might see such displays not as enjoyable enhancements to life, but as signs of moral weakness, effeminacy, and a decline from a more virtuous, austere past. This judgmental attitude, even if unspoken, would hardly endear them to their host, or fellow guests who were happily indulging in said luxuries. It's hard to enjoy your honey-glazed dormouse when the guest next to you is radiating an aura of silent, stoic disapproval for your decadent lifestyle. This Spartan suspicion of luxury and its corrupting influence is a well-documented mainstream historical fact, frequently commented upon by ancient writers. Their physical comportment, too, would likely set them apart. Accustomed to hard benches, rough living, and constant physical training, a Spartan might find the leisurely reclining on couches at a symposium awkward and unnatural. They might sit too stiffly, move too abruptly, lacking the graceful, relaxed posture of their more cosmopolitan counterparts. Their very bearing, honed for the battlefield, might seem out of place in a setting dedicated to pleasure and relaxation. They were warriors, not wastrels, and it probably showed. What about their appreciation for the arts and entertainment that were so central to symposia and other Greek social gatherings? While Spartans, as you know, had their own forms of music and dance, these were almost exclusively martial or religious in character, designed to instill discipline or honor the gods in a very specific, state-approved manner. The more lyrical, erotic, or purely aesthetic forms of poetry, music, and dance favored in other parts of Greece might have been incomprehensible or even offensive to a Spartan sensibility. The sound of a flute girl playing a soft, seductive melody might not inspire a Spartan to philosophical contemplation, but perhaps to a private thought about how such music would be utterly useless for marching into battle. Their definition of good entertainment was likely very, very different. And then there's the wine. While Spartans did drink wine, usually diluted, as part of their Syssitian meals, drunkenness was, as you've heard, heavily stigmatized. At an Athenian symposium, where wine flowed freely and was often seen as a catalyst for philosophical insight, poetic inspiration, or simply good fellowship, up to a point, of course, a Spartan might either abstain almost entirely, thus appearing unsociable, or, if he did partake, might lack the cultural cues for moderate convivial drinking, perhaps becoming either sullenly silent or even worse, uncharacteristically and probably awkwardly boisterous if he overindulged. The precise Spartan attitude towards wine consumption in social settings outside the Syssitia is not always clear, but it's unlikely they were known for their light-hearted toasting and drinking songs. One quirky, lesser-known aspect that might have contributed to their bad party guest reputation could be their legendary honesty, which, while a virtue in itself, could be socially disastrous if untempered by tact or diplomacy. A Spartan, asked for his opinion, might give it with brutal, unvarnished frankness, regardless of whether it was polite or welcome. "What did you think of my new poem, Leonidas?" It lacked meter and sense. Such directness, while perhaps refreshing, in some contexts, is generally not conducive to a relaxed and enjoyable party atmosphere. The extent to which brutal honesty was a defining Spartan trait in all social interactions is debatable, but it certainly fits with their laconic and pragmatic image. So it wasn't just one thing that made a Spartan a potential party pooper. It was a whole constellation of cultural traits: their brevity of speech, their austerity, their disdain for luxury, their narrowly focused appreciation of the arts, their potentially awkward relationship with alcohol in a social setting, and perhaps even their uncomfortably direct honesty. They were, in essence, professional outsiders when it came to the convivial norms of much of the rest of the Greek world. They weren't necessarily trying to be rude. They were simply being Spartan. And in the context of a party designed for pleasure, relaxation, and sophisticated enjoyment, being Spartan was often synonymous with killing the vibe, the image of that stoically awkward Spartan, casting a laconian chill over the lively Athenian. Symposium now begins to gently shift. While the Spartans might have been champions in the league of vibe killers, they certainly didn't hold a monopoly on being less than ideal party guests in the ancient world. Our sleepy gaze now drifts from the disciplined plains of Laconia to the bustling, seven-hilled metropolis of Rome. Here, amidst the grandeur of the Republic and later the Empire, you'd also find figures whose stern demeanor, unbending principles, or sheer lack of social grace meant they probably weren't the first name on anyone's guest list if a truly rip-roaring convivium, the Roman equivalent of a dinner party or banquet, was being planned. We focus now on the Roman stick-in-the-mud senator, or similar public figures, who, like their Spartan counterparts, might have brought a certain gravitas, but precious little gaiety, to the feast. Imagine a Roman dinner party, perhaps in the elegant villa of a wealthy patrician. Guests recline on cushioned couches around a low table. Servants flit about with trays of delicacies, roasted dormice with honey perhaps, or flamingo tongues, and wine, often mixed with water, and sometimes spices flows freely. Conversation is lively, ranging from political gossip and business deals to literary discussions and bawdy jokes. It's a scene of cultivated indulgence, a display of wealth, taste, and social connection. Now, into this scene, introduce a figure like Cato the Elder, Marcus Porcius Cato, a renowned Roman statesman, orator, and writer of the 2nd century BCE. Cato was famous for his stern adherence to traditional Roman virtues, mos maiorum, his frugality, his harsh moral judgments, and his general disdain for what he saw as the corrupting influence of Greek luxury and refinement that was becoming fashionable in Rome. He was a man of immense integrity and principle, a pillar of the Republic, but by all accounts, he probably wasn't what you'd call the life of the party. This portrayal of Cato the Elder as a paragon of old Roman austerity and a critic of Hellenizing luxury is a well-established mainstream historical image. If Cato the Elder were your dinner guest, you might find him scrutinizing the menu for signs of excessive extravagance, perhaps muttering disapprovingly about the cost of the imported wine, or the overly elaborate presentation of the peacock. He might deliver a lengthy, unsolicited lecture on the virtues of simple peasant fare and the decline of Roman manliness. His conversation, while undoubtedly learned, would likely be heavy with moral pronouncements and criticisms of contemporary society rather than light-hearted banter or amusing anecdotes. He was known for his unyielding opposition to anything he considered decadent or un-Roman. One can imagine the other guests subtly trying to steer the conversation to less judgmental topics, or perhaps just refilling their wine cups a little, more frequently, to endure his company. Other Roman figures, particularly those known for their Stoic philosophy, might also have presented a somewhat somber presence at a convivial gathering. Stoicism, with its emphasis on virtue, reason, self-control, and indifference to pleasure or pain, didn't exactly lend itself to wild abandon or frivolous merrymaking. While a Stoic philosopher might engage in profound and enlightening conversation, they were unlikely to be leading the drinking songs or laughing uproariously at a slightly off-color joke. Their very demeanor, one of calm detachment and serious contemplation, could inadvertently dampen the spirits of those around them who were simply trying to enjoy a good meal and some light entertainment. Consider also the ambitious Roman politician, intensely focused on power and reputation. While some might have been skilled social butterflies, adept at charming their way through any gathering, others might have been so consumed by their political maneuvering, so wary of saying or doing the wrong thing, that they came across as stiff, calculating, or insincere. Every conversation would be a potential opportunity or a potential threat. Every interaction weighed for its political implications. Such a guest might be physically present at the convivium, but their mind would be elsewhere, constantly assessing the room, making mental notes, and perhaps subtly trying to undermine their rivals. It's hard to relax and enjoy the spiced wine when you suspect the person next to you is mentally drafting a denunciation to the emperor. One quirky, lesser-known type of Roman stick-in-the-mud might have been the overly pedantic scholar or grammarian, invited perhaps for their learning, but who then proceeded to correct everyone's Latin pronunciation, dissect every philosophical argument with excruciating detail, or launch into lengthy, unsolicited disquisitions on obscure historical points. While intellectual discussion was a valued part of many Roman gatherings, a guest who dominated the conversation with relentless pedantry, displaying their learning rather than engaging in genuine dialogue, could quickly become tiresome. The precise social dynamics of dealing with such intellectual bores in Roman society are not always explicitly recorded, but human nature suggests they would have been as trying then as they are now. It's also worth remembering that Roman society, like Spartan society, was deeply hierarchical. The presence of a very high-ranking magistrate, a powerful senator, or, in the imperial era, someone known to be a close associate of the emperor, could cast a chill over a gathering if lower-status guests felt intimidated or constrained in their speech and behavior. Even if the powerful individual themselves was attempting to be convivial, their very status could act as a social inhibitor. The delicate dance of flattery, deference, and cautious conversation required when dining with one's superiors could make for a rather stressful rather than relaxing evening. So, while the specific reasons for their party-pooping potential might differ from the Spartans, perhaps less about ingrained austerity and more about moral sternness, philosophical detachment, political ambition, or intellectual pedantry, the Romans certainly had their share of individuals who could turn a lively convivium into a somewhat more subdued or even downright uncomfortable affair. The ideal Roman host, much like hosts throughout history, probably spent a good deal of time carefully curating their guest lists, hoping to achieve that perfect blend of stimulating conversation, good cheer, and, above all, an absence of anyone, likely to deliver a lecture on the declining moral standards of the youth while everyone else was trying to enjoy the honeyed wine. The somewhat stern and judgmental atmosphere of a Roman convivium attended by Cato the Elder, or perhaps a brooding, stoic philosopher, now begins to shift. The scent of roasted dormice and spiced wine fades, replaced by a simpler, perhaps more austere aroma, maybe that of plain-baked bread, root vegetables, and a distinct lack of frivolous seasoning. You find yourself crossing the centuries, and indeed the Atlantic, to a very different kind of social gathering. The early Puritan settlements of 17th century New England. Here, at their potlucks and communal meals, spiritual reflection, sober discourse, and the meticulous observance of religious duty were firmly on the menu, while overt mirth, boisterous laughter, and anything resembling worldly pleasure were often viewed with deep suspicion, if not outright condemnation. Inviting a group of early Puritans to your idea of a party might result in a very quiet, very prayerful, and perhaps rather guilt-inducing evening. Imagine a simple, unadorned meeting house, or a plain, timber-framed home in a fledgling New England colony. The furnishings are sparse and functional, long wooden tables, hard benches, perhaps a few pewter dishes or wooden trenchers. There are no colourful tapestries, no frivolous decorations, no musical instruments, unless used for sacred psalmody. The Puritans, who sought to purify the Church of England from what they saw as its lingering Catholic travesties and worldly corruptions, valued plainness, sobriety, hard work, and above all, a deep and personal piety. Their social gatherings, even those involving food, were often extensions of their religious life, occasions for fellowship. Yes, but also for spiritual edification and the reinforcement of communal moral standards. This emphasis on religious purpose in Puritan social gatherings is a mainstream historical understanding of their culture. If you were to attend a Puritan communal meal, perhaps after a lengthy Sunday sermon or a midweek lecture, the atmosphere would be one of solemnity and order. Grace would be said, often at considerable length. Conversation would likely revolve around religious matters, the interpretation of scripture, the state of one's soul, the workings of providence in daily life, or perhaps the perceived moral failings of the community or the wider world. Laughter, if it occurred at all, would be subdued, and certainly not of the raucous, unrestrained variety. Frivolous chatter, gossip, or worldly topics might be frowned upon, seen as distractions from more important spiritual concerns. The food itself would be simple and nourishing, but rarely extravagant. The Puritans, while not necessarily eschewing all pleasure, were deeply suspicious of luxury and sensual indulgence, which they saw as snares of the devil. A meal might consist of plain bread, boiled or stewed vegetables, like pumpkins, squash, or beans, perhaps some salted fish or simple meat if available, and water or small beer. There would be no elaborate sauces, no exotic spices, no delicate pastries designed merely to please the palate. The purpose of food was to sustain life and provide strength for work and worship, not to be an occasion for gluttony or ostentatious display. Entertainment, in the sense we might understand it, would be largely absent. Dancing, card playing, dice games, and theatrical performances were all generally condemned by stricter Puritans as sinful vanities. If there was music, it would likely be the unaccompanied singing of psalms. Storytelling might occur, but the stories would almost certainly have a moral or religious lesson. The idea of a party purely for fun, for light-hearted amusement, and relaxation would have been alien and probably deeply suspect to many early New England Puritans. Even festive occasions like weddings or harvest celebrations, while acknowledged, would be marked by a certain sobriety and religious framing. There might be a communal feast, yes, but it would likely be accompanied by prayers, sermons, and exhortations to thankfulness and right living, rather than by the boisterous merrymaking found in many other contemporary cultures. The focus was always on God, on duty, on the salvation of one's soul, and on the building of a godly community in the wilderness. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of Puritan social control involved their detailed laws and community vigilance regarding disorderly conduct. This could include not just obvious offences like drunkenness or brawling, but also things like idleness, vain discourse, uncharitable speech, or even excessive merriment if it was deemed unseemly or disruptive to the sober piety of the community. Individuals could be brought before the church elders or local magistrates for such infractions, facing fines, public admonishment, or even spells in the stocks. The precise definition and enforcement of these disorderly conduct rules and how they impacted private social gatherings is a subject that continues to be explored by historians of early American social and legal history. So, if you were hoping for a rollicking good time, a Puritan potluck might not be your first choice. The conversation would be edifying, certainly. The food, while plain, would likely be wholesome, but the general atmosphere would be one of serious purpose, moral scrutiny, and an ever-present awareness of one's spiritual state. They weren't necessarily bad at parties in the sense of being intentionally rude or disruptive like a boorish Spartan might be. Rather, their entire worldview, their profound religious convictions, and their suspicion of worldly pleasures meant that their idea of a good gathering was fundamentally different from what most other cultures, then or now, might envision. Piety was prized far above pleasure, and a gathering that did not serve a higher spiritual purpose was likely seen as time misspent, a distraction from the serious business of salvation. It makes that Spartan black broth almost sound like a party in comparison, doesn't it? The sober, prayerful atmosphere of that Puritan potluck, with its earnest discourse and suspicion of worldly mirth, now begins to dissolve, and you're sleepy. Attention drifts back towards the glittering, yet often treacherous halls of royal power. While a Spartan envoy or a stern Puritan elder might kill the vibe at a party through their inherent cultural austerity or religious conviction, sometimes the biggest party pooper in the room was the host himself or herself. We now consider those monarchs throughout history whose temperament, political anxieties, or sheer tyrannical caprice could transform a grand courtly feast from a joyous celebration into a deeply uncomfortable, even terrifying ordeal for their unfortunate guests. When kings killed the mood, the resulting royal ruckus was often a far cry from festive. Imagine yourself a courtier, perhaps in the lavish court of a Renaissance Italian prince, a medieval European king, or even an ancient Eastern potentate. You've been summoned to a royal banquet, an occasion that should, in theory, be one of honor, pleasure, and an opportunity to curry favor or engage in high-level networking. The hall is magnificently decorated. The finest musicians are playing, discreetly of course, and the tables groan under the weight of exotic delicacies and gleaming gold plate. But your enjoyment is tinged with a nervous apprehension, because everything depends on the mood of the monarch at the head of the table. If the king is in a foul temper, perhaps due to a military setback, a political betrayal, a nagging toothache, or simply a fit of royal ennui, the entire atmosphere of the feast can become heavy with unspoken dread. Every laugh might sound too loud, every conversation too frivolous. Courtiers would watch the monarch's expression with hawk-like intensity, trying to gauge his mood, desperate to avoid saying or doing anything that might attract his ire. A poorly timed jest, a perceived slight, even an accidental spilling of wine could lead to a furious outburst, a public humiliation, or, in the courts of more tyrannical rulers, something far worse. The historical record is replete with tales of monarchs whose unpredictable tempers made their feasts exercises in extreme caution for their guests. King Henry VIII of England, for example, was known for his volatile moods in his later years, and dining with him when he was displeased must have been a nerve-wracking experience. Political paranoia was another potent mood killer. In courts riddled with factionalism, intrigue, and the constant threat of conspiracy, a royal feast could become a stage for subtle power plays and dangerous undercurrents. The king might use the occasion to publicly snub a rival, to test the loyalty of his courtiers, or to make veiled threats. Guests would be acutely aware of who was seated where, proximity to the monarch being a key indicator of favor, who was speaking to whom, and who seemed to be in or out of the royal good graces. The food, however delicious, might taste like ash in their mouths if they feared they were on the wrong side of a political divide, or if they suspected the king was using the gathering to root out perceived enemies. The reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, for instance, was marked by an atmosphere of suspicion and treason trials, and one imagines his banquets were not particularly relaxing affairs. Sometimes the monarch's own peculiar habits or demands could cast a pall over the festivities. Perhaps the king insisted on absolute silence during certain parts of the meal, or had a list of forbidden topics of conversation. Maybe he had very specific and often bizarre dietary restrictions that all his guests were expected to observe. Or perhaps he subjected his courtiers to tedious, lengthy monologues, or forced them to participate in entertainments that were anything but entertaining, like listening to his own terrible poetry or watching a particularly inept court jester. The need to feign enjoyment and approval in such situations, while inwardly cringing or seething, would have been a common courtly skill. One quirky, lesser-known way a monarch could kill the mood might involve their pets. Some rulers were inordinately fond of their animals, dogs, cats, monkeys, even more exotic creatures, and might insist on them being present at banquets, sometimes even seated at the table, or being fed choice morsels from the royal plate. While perhaps endearing to the monarch, for guests who were not so animal-inclined, or who were allergic, or who simply found it unhygienic, this could make for a rather uncomfortable dining experience. The precise extent to which royal pets were truly disruptive at formal feasts is often anecdotal, but the image of a spoiled royal lapdog yapping through a state dinner is an amusing one. It's a subject of ongoing historical fascination how courtiers navigated these potentially fraught social situations. A successful courtier needed to be a master of diplomacy, flattery, and self-control, able to read the monarch's mood, to laugh at his jokes, however unfunny, to offer wise counsel, but only when asked and only if it aligned with the king's own views, and above all, to avoid giving offense. It was a constant, exhausting performance, where a single misstep could lead to ruin. So, as you sit at that glittering, yet potentially perilous, royal table, the wine in your goblet might seem less like a source of cheer and more like a test of your nerve. The laughter of your fellow courtiers might sound a little too forced, their smiles a little too bright. The king's every word, every gesture, every shift in expression is a portent to be carefully analysed. This wasn't just a meal, it was a high-stakes social and political arena where the host held all the cards, and often a very short fuse. When the king himself was the party pooper, the entire court held its breath, and the only sensible course of action was to eat sparingly, speak even more sparingly, and pray for the evening to end without a royal ruckus. The tense, often nerve-wracking atmosphere of a royal banquet, hosted by a moody or paranoid monarch, begins to dissipate, and your sleepy attention now broadens to encompass the wider world of intercultural social encounters in antiquity. While a Spartan might be a domestic party pooper in Athens, or a Puritan elder might cast a chill over a more worldly gathering, sometimes the most epic social calamities arose not from individual temperament, but from a fundamental clash of customs. We'll now quietly observe how differing cultural norms around hospitality, feasting, gift-giving, and general celebratory behavior could lead to profound, if sometimes unintentionally hilarious, social misunderstandings and awkward encounters. When ancient peoples from different backgrounds came together, imagine trying to navigate a feast where your host's idea of politeness is your idea of a mortal insult, or vice versa. Consider the accounts of early Greek or Roman travelers, merchants, or envoys venturing into what they considered barbarian lands, perhaps encountering Celtic tribes in Gaul, Germanic peoples across the Rhine, or Scythians on the vast Eurasian steppes. These encounters, often recorded with a distinct air of cultural superiority by the Greco-Roman writers, are filled with descriptions of customs that seemed bizarre, uncivilized, or even shocking to them. For example, the Greek historian Herodotus describes the Scythians as drinking undiluted wine, a sign of barbarity to the Greeks, who always mixed their wine with water, and engaging in rather wild ecstatic rituals. A Roman envoy, accustomed to the formal etiquette of a senatorial dinner, might be utterly bewildered and perhaps deeply offended by the boisterous, mead-fueled feasting habits of a Germanic chieftain, with its loud boasting, rough-hewn manners, and different concepts of personal space or appropriate conversation. This clash of dining and drinking customs is a well-documented theme in ancient ethnographic writing. Conversely, imagine a Celtic chieftain, accustomed to feasts where warriors sat on the floor around a communal cauldron and tore at roasted meat, with their hands being invited to a sophisticated Roman convivium. The reclining couches, the multiple courses served on individual plates, the use of spoons, though not usually forks, the carefully diluted wine, the philosophical discussions. All of it might seem alien, effeminate, or simply incomprehensible to him. He might inadvertently commit numerous faux pas, perhaps by reaching for food out of turn, speaking too loudly, or failing to appreciate the subtleties of Roman etiquette, leading to mutual discomfort and misunderstanding. Gift-giving, a crucial element of social and diplomatic interaction in most ancient societies, was another minefield for intercultural encounters. The type of gift considered appropriate, the manner of its presentation, and the expected reciprocity could vary enormously. A gift that was highly valued in one culture might be seen as insignificant or even insulting in another. For example, offering a Roman official a gift that was perceived as a bribe rather than a token of respect could lead to serious trouble. Similarly, a barbarian envoy offering a gift that seemed too lavish or too meager to his Roman counterpart could cause offense or suspicion. The failure to understand these nuanced gift-giving protocols could derail diplomatic missions or sour trade relationships. Language barriers, of course, would have been a major source of awkwardness and misunderstanding, even with interpreters, who were not always reliable or unbiased. Conveying complex ideas, subtle nuances of meaning, or even simple pleasantries across a linguistic divide would be a constant challenge. A poorly translated compliment could come across as an insult. A misunderstood instruction could lead to a diplomatic incident, and a joke that was hilarious in one language could fall utterly flat, or worse, be deeply offensive in another. The potential for lost in translation moments to escalate into serious social or political problems was ever present. Religious customs and taboos were another fertile ground for intercultural clashes. What was sacred in one culture might be profane or simply meaningless in another. An unknowing traveler might accidentally violate a local religious prohibition by entering a sacred grove without permission, by eating a forbidden food, or by failing to show proper reverence to a local deity, and thereby cause grave offense to their hosts, potentially endangering themselves and their companions. The precise nature and importance of local cults and their specific taboos are often highlighted in ancient accounts of travel and intercultural contact, underscoring the dangers for the uninformed. One quirky, lesser-known example of clashing customs might involve different attitudes towards time and punctuality, though our modern obsession with precise timing is largely a product of the industrial age. In some ancient cultures, arriving on time for a feast or a meeting might be less important than in others, or the very concept of scheduling might be more fluid. An envoy from a highly structured society arriving in a culture with a more relaxed attitude towards time might find themselves waiting for hours, feeling slighted or disrespected when no offense was intended. The interpretation of such differences in temporal norms is a subtle but interesting aspect of cross-cultural understanding. It is a subject of ongoing scholarly research, how ancient peoples, particularly those involved in long-distance trade or diplomacy, managed to navigate these complex intercultural encounters. Presumably, experienced travelers and envoys developed a degree of cultural sensitivity, learned key phrases, and relied on trusted local intermediaries. But the potential for awkwardness, for offense, for a complete breakdown in communication due to clashing customs was always there. So, as you picture that Roman diplomat trying to make polite conversation with a Scythian nomad over a bowl of fermented mare's milk, or a Viking trader attempting to haggle with a Byzantine merchant using only gestures and a few badly pronounced Greek phrases, you see that the what not to do abroad list was probably very long and often learned through embarrassing and sometimes dangerous trial and error. These clashing customs serve as a gentle reminder that what seems perfectly normal and polite in one corner of the world can be utterly baffling or even deeply offensive in another, a timeless truth for any traveler, ancient or modern. The awkwardness of those intercultural encounters, with their clashing customs and potential for epic social misunderstandings, now leads us to consider another category of unwelcome attendees who could thoroughly ruin an ancient party or gathering: the guest from Hades, or at least those individuals whose presence was so undesirable, so disruptive, or so downright terrifying, they might as well have been an emissary from the underworld itself. From the brazen professional party crashers of ancient Greece, who freeloaded their way through symposia, to the demanding, often capricious deities who had a habit of inviting themselves to human affairs and expecting the very best, naturally. Sometimes the worst party guest wasn't even strictly human, or at least, not one you'd willingly put on the invitation list. Let's first consider the very human, yet highly unwelcome figure of the ancient party crasher. In ancient Greece, particularly at Athenian symposia, those lively drinking parties you've glimpsed, there was a known type of individual called a parasitos, parasite, or a kolax, flatterer. These weren't parasites in the biological sense, but rather uninvited guests who would attach themselves to wealthy patrons or insinuate themselves into private gatherings, hoping for a free meal, free wine, and perhaps an opportunity to gain favor or extract some benefit. They were often skilled in flattery, quick with a jest, though sometimes their humor was forced or unwelcome, and possessed of a thick skin, able to endure snubs and insults in pursuit of their goal. Greek comedies, like those of Aristophanes or Menander, frequently feature such characters, portraying them as objects of ridicule and social scorn. This figure of the professional freeloader or sycophant at ancient Greek banquets is a well-documented mainstream historical type. Imagine trying to enjoy a philosophical discussion with Socrates, while a particularly persistent parasitos keeps interrupting to offer fawning compliments to your host in a blatant attempt to score an extra helping of honeyed figs. The Romans, too, had their share of such unwelcome hangers-on at their convivia. The poet Martial, for instance, writes scathingly of dinner hunters, Senipite, who would go to great lengths to secure an invitation to a wealthy man's table, enduring all sorts of humiliations for the sake of a good meal. The host might find it difficult to refuse such individuals without appearing ungenerous, yet their presence could lower the tone of the gathering and annoy the more distinguished guests. But what about those guests who were truly from, or at least represented, a more spectral realm? In many ancient cultures, there was a strong belief that the spirits of the dead could, and sometimes did, return to trouble the living, especially if their funeral rites had been neglected, or if they had a grievance. Imagine hosting a feast, only to have the uninvited and decidedly unsettling ghost of your great-uncle Tiberius, whom you conveniently forgot to invite to his own memorial feast, appear, perhaps rattling his spectral chains or moaning about the quality of the afterlife catering. While not a party guest in the conventional sense, the unexpected appearance of a revenant or a malevolent spirit, perhaps drawn by the sounds of merriment or the smell of food, would certainly put a damper on any celebration. Many ancient rituals, like the Roman Lemuria you recall, where beans were thrown to appease restless spirits, were specifically designed to keep such unwanted ghostly attendees at bay. Then there were the gods themselves. In ancient mythologies, deities often took a very active and sometimes very intrusive interest in human affairs, including their parties. A god or goddess might decide to show up unannounced at a mortal feast or wedding, sometimes in disguise, sometimes in their full, divine glory. Their presence could be a great honor, of course, but it could also be incredibly dangerous. Gods were notoriously touchy, quick to take offense at any perceived slight, being offered the wrong kind of sacrifice, not being given the seat of honor, or simply not being sufficiently adulated. The consequences of offending a divine party crasher could be catastrophic, ranging from personal transformation, like being turned into a spider if you're Arachne and you've offended Athena, to the utter destruction of a city. The Trojan War, according to one version of the myth, famously began because of a dispute among goddesses at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, where Eris, the goddess of discord, who pointedly hadn't been invited, threw in a golden apple inscribed, "For the fairest." That's one heck of a party foul. One quirky, lesser-known type of unwanted attendee might be an animal that was considered a bad omen. If, during a solemn outdoor banquet or religious festival, a crow landed on the altar, or a snake slithered across the feasting ground, or an owl hooted from a nearby tree at an inopportune moment, it could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure or impending misfortune, effectively crashing the party with a wave of superstitious dread. The guests might become anxious, the host might feel compelled to perform expiatory rites, and the festive mood would certainly be broken. The precise interpretation of such animal omens and the level of disruption they caused would vary, but the potential for them to kill the vibe was very real. It is a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion how literally these tales of divine, party crashers, or ghostly visitations were believed, versus how much they served as metaphorical or cautionary narratives about the importance of piety, proper ritual, and respecting the unseen forces of the cosmos. However, the sheer prevalence of such stories in ancient myth and folklore suggests a deep-seated anxiety about the permeability of the boundary between the human and the supernatural realms, and the potential for unwelcome entities to intrude upon even the most joyful human gatherings. So, as you imagine trying to manage your ancient guest list, you're not just worried about your boorish Spartan cousin or your sycophantic Roman acquaintance. You're also keeping a wary eye out for freeloading flatterers, restless ancestral spirits, easily offended deities who might just pop in for a smiting, and any stray black cats or ominous owls that might decide to join the festivities uninvited. It makes the modern problem of an unexpected +1 seem rather trivial in comparison, doesn't it? The guest from Hades, in whatever form they took, was the ultimate party nightmare in antiquity. The spectral chill of those unwanted ghostly guests and the disruptive grandeur of divine party crashers begin to fade, and your sleepy attention drifts towards the more structured, yet not always more joyful, world of medieval feasting and monastic meals. While a grand baronial hall might seem like the epitome of medieval revelry, the reality for many, particularly the entertainers or lower status attendees, could be far less glamorous. And if you ventured within the hallowed, and often very silent, walls of a monastery, you'd find supper times that were anything but a party. We'll now explore this less dazzling side of historical dining, from the sometimes forced and underappreciated efforts of medieval minstrels to the strict, contemplative, and decidedly unfestive meals within monastic refectories. Imagine yourself in the great hall of a powerful medieval lord, perhaps during the 12th or 13th century. The room is vast and draughty, lit by smoky torches and a large central hearth if you're lucky, or by smaller, less effective fireplaces along the walls. The trestle tables are laden with huge platters of roasted meats, boar, venison, swan, trenchers of coarse bread, and flagons of ale or rough wine. The noise level is considerable. The clatter of knives, the boisterous shouts and laughter of the lord and his knights, the barking of hounds under the table. It seems like a scene of unrestrained medieval merrymaking. But now, picture yourself as a travelling minstrel, a jongleur or a gleeman, hoping to earn your supper and a few coins with your performance. You stand in a corner, or perhaps on a small, rickety platform, trying to make yourself heard above the din. You might play the lute, the vielle, a medieval fiddle, or the pipe, and sing epic poems of chivalry, mournful ballads of unrequited love, or bawdy comic songs. The pressure to entertain a rowdy, often inebriated, and not always appreciative, audience would be immense. If your performance was deemed dull, or if your songs offended the lord or his guests, you might be met not with applause, but with jeers, thrown scraps of food, or even a summary dismissal without payment. This precarious existence of medieval entertainers, dependent on the whims of their patrons, is a well-documented mainstream historical fact. Their fun was often a very serious business, a constant struggle for a meagre living. Even for the guests of lower status at such a feast, the less important knights, the household retainers, the visiting merchants, the experience might be less about joyous participation and more about careful observance of hierarchy and etiquette. They would be seated below the salt, a large, often ornate salt cellar that marked a social dividing line on the table, served inferior cuts of meat, and expected to remain relatively quiet and deferential while the lord and his honoured guests held forth. It was a feast, yes, but one where your place in the social order was constantly reinforced. Now, let's shift scenes dramatically, leaving the boisterous, if hierarchical, baronial hall and stepping into the quiet, contemplative atmosphere of a medieval monastery. Here, mealtimes in the refectory were governed by strict rules of silence, religious observance, and communal discipline. Imagine the long, polished wooden tables, the monks or nuns in their simple uniform habits, eating their frugal meal, perhaps vegetable pottage, bread, and a little cheese or fish. Meat was often forbidden or restricted in many monastic orders. The most striking feature of a monastic meal would be the silence. Conversation was usually forbidden, or at least strictly limited. Instead, one of the brothers or sisters would often read aloud from a sacred text, the Bible, the lives of the saints, or the writings of the church fathers, from a raised pulpit or lectern. The purpose of the meal was not social enjoyment, but necessary sustenance and spiritual edification. The food itself was to be consumed with gratitude and moderation, without any sign of gluttony or fussiness. This practice of silent meals, accompanied by religious readings, is a key characteristic of traditional monastic life. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of monastic dining might involve the use of specific hand gestures or signs to communicate necessary requests, like pass the salt or more water, without breaking the rule of silence. These sign languages could become quite elaborate in some orders, a whole silent vocabulary for the refectory. The development and use of these monastic sign languages is a fascinating, if niche, area of historical study. For a visitor accustomed to more boisterous or conversational mealtimes, a monastic supper would be a profoundly different and perhaps quite unsettling experience. The silence, the plain food, the constant religious reading, the aura of disciplined piety. It was the absolute antithesis of a party. There were no minstrels here, no bawdy jokes, no clinking of goblets in cheerful toasts. There was only a quiet, communal partaking of sustenance, a moment of shared spiritual focus in a life dedicated to prayer and work. Even outside the refectory, the general atmosphere within a monastery was one of order, discipline, and a turning away from worldly pleasures. While some monasteries, particularly large and wealthy ones, might occasionally host important secular guests with a degree of ceremony, the underlying ethos was one of austerity and spiritual devotion. The misery in monastic misery at supper time is perhaps an overstatement from a purely secular, pleasure-seeking perspective. For the monks and nuns who had chosen that life, it was a path to spiritual fulfillment. But for an uninvited party animal who somehow found themselves at a Benedictine silent supper, it would undoubtedly feel like a particularly grim and joyless affair. So, from the forced jollity and precarious existence of the medieval minstrel, trying to please a rowdy baronial audience, to the profound, prayerful silence of the monastic refectory, you see that even in an age known for its grand feasts and chivalric celebrations, the experience of partying, or even just eating with others, could be a far cry from a simple good time. It was often a reflection of power, hierarchy, religious devotion, or economic necessity, and rarely just about the food or the fun. The somewhat forced merriment of the medieval minstrel and the profound, prayerful silence of the monastic refectory now begin to fade, and your sleepy thoughts drift back to ancient Greece, but this time to a very different kind of gathering than one a Spartan might awkwardly attend. As a gentle contrast to the austerity, the discipline, or the sheer social awkwardness you've witnessed in some of our previous historical soirees, we'll now take a peek into the lively, stimulating, and often quite boisterous world of the Athenian symposium. Here, reclining on couches, garlands on their heads, wine cups in hand, Athenian men engaged in an intoxicating blend of philosophical debate, poetic recitation, witty conversation, political discourse, and, yes, a fair amount of wine-fueled merriment. This was a scene that highlights precisely what our dour Spartan friends, and perhaps some of those other historical party poopers, were so spectacularly missing out on. Imagine yourself invited to an Athenian symposium in, say, the 5th or 4th century BCE. The setting is likely the andron, the men's quarter of a private Athenian house, a room specifically designed for such gatherings. You and the other guests, all male citizens. Respectable women were generally excluded from symposia, though female. Entertainers, like flute girls, dancers, and hetairae, sophisticated courtesans, were often present. Recline on cushioned couches arranged around the room. The atmosphere is initially one of refined conversation as you partake of the evening meal, which was usually eaten before the symposium proper began. Once dinner is cleared away, the symposium truly commences. Craters, large ornate ceramic bowls, are brought in, filled with wine that is then carefully mixed with water by a designated symposiarch, or master of ceremonies, who also sets the rules for drinking and the topics for discussion or entertainment for the evening. Drinking undiluted wine, as you know, was considered barbaric by the Greeks. The aim was to achieve a state of pleasant intoxication that stimulated conversation and creativity, not drunken oblivion. Though that sometimes happened too. This ritualized mixing and consumption of wine, overseen by a symposiarch, is a mainstream historical feature of the Athenian symposium. The conversation is the lifeblood of the symposium. It might range from profound philosophical inquiries. Plato's famous dialogue, The Symposium, is set during such a gathering and explores the nature of love, eros, to discussions of politics, poetry, current events, or simply witty banter and storytelling. Guests would be expected to contribute, to display their learning, their eloquence, and their ability to engage in clever, stimulating discourse. This wasn't just idle chatter, it was a form of intellectual performance and social bonding. Poetry, both recited and improvised, played a crucial role. Guests might recite passages from Homer or other revered poets, or compose their own short verses, perhaps epigrams, drinking songs, scholia, or love poems, on the spot. There might be poetic competitions, with prizes for the cleverest or most moving composition. Music was also essential. Flute girls, auletrides, would provide a sensual, melodic accompaniment to the conversation and recitations. Sometimes guests themselves might play the lyre and sing. Games were another popular feature. Kottabos was a favourite, a rather messy game that involved flinging the dregs of one's wine from a kylix, a shallow drinking cup, at a target, often a metal disc balanced on a stand, or small saucers floating in a larger bowl of water. The aim was to knock the disc off or sink the saucers, with success supposedly auguring well for one's love life. Other games might involve riddles, wordplay, or tests of wit. The presence of hetairai could add another dimension to the symposium. These were often educated, accomplished women who provided not just physical companionship, but also witty conversation, musical entertainment, and intellectual stimulation. They were a distinct class from ordinary prostitutes and could achieve a degree of independence and influence, though their social position was still ambiguous. The role and status of hetairai in Athenian society and at symposia are complex subjects that continue to be discussed by historians. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of the symposium might involve the ritual libations poured at the beginning and, throughout the evening, dedicated to various gods, particularly Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and theatre, who was the presiding deity of such gatherings. These libations, accompanied by prayers or hymns, infuse the revelry with a sense of sacredness, linking the earthly pleasures of wine and fellowship to the divine realm. Of course, not all symposia were high-minded philosophical discussions. They could also devolve into drunken revelry, bawdy behaviour, and even occasional brawls, especially as the night wore on and the wine took its toll. The symposiarch's role was, in part, to try and maintain some semblance of order and prevent things from getting too out of hand, though his success in this was not always guaranteed. But at its best, the Athenian symposium was a unique and vibrant institution, a space for intellectual exploration, artistic expression, social bonding, and a carefully cultivated form of pleasurable intoxication. It was a world away from the austere discipline of Sparta or the solemn piety of a Puritan gathering. Here, conversation was an art form, pleasure was embraced, albeit, ideally, with a degree of moderation and refinement, and the human mind and spirit were celebrated. As you recline on your couch, a garland of ivy on your head, a cup of fragrant wine in your hand, listening to a beautifully recited poem, or engaging in a lively debate, you can appreciate the rich tapestry of sensations and ideas that the Spartans, in their relentless pursuit of martial virtue, so thoroughly missed. This was the art of the party, Athenian style. The lively, wine-scented atmosphere of that Athenian symposium, with its philosophical debates and poetic recitations, begins to gently fade, and your mind, lulled by these varied tales of historical, social gatherings, turns to a soft, sleepy reflection. You've encountered the stoic, party-pooping Spartan, the stern Roman senator, the pious Puritan, the moody monarch, the confused intercultural envoy, and even the ghostly gatecrasher. Why is it that these stories of centuries-old social clumsiness, these accounts of historical party fouls and awkward encounters, still manage to bring a faint, almost involuntary smile to our faces, a gentle chuckle into our pillows, even as we drift off to sleep? Perhaps part of the appeal lies in the simple, timeless relatability of social awkwardness. Who among us hasn't experienced that cringeworthy moment at a party? Saying the wrong thing, laughing at the wrong time, feeling utterly out of place, or witnessing someone else spectacularly kill the vibe. These ancient anecdotes, whether it's a Spartan staring blankly at an Athenian joke or a Roman official accidentally insulting his host, resonate because they tap into a universal human experience. Social interaction is complex, and the potential for missteps is always there, regardless of the century or the toga. Knowing that even formidable historical figures weren't immune to such gaffes is somehow comforting, a reminder of our shared, fallible humanity. There's also an element of gentle superiority, isn't there? We look back from our modern vantage point, with our supposedly more sophisticated social graces and psychological understanding, and we can't help but feel a touch amused by the perceived naivety or rigidity of past societies. The Spartans' inability to appreciate fine wine, the Puritans' suspicion of laughter, the Romans' obsessive adherence to status, these can seem quaint, even silly to us. It's a safe, harmless form of historical judgment, allowing us to feel a little more enlightened, a little more evolved, even if, in reality, we have our own modern set of equally baffling social codes and anxieties that future generations will undoubtedly chuckle at. This tendency to view past customs with a degree of modern condescension, while needing to be tempered with historical empathy, is a common popular reaction. The sheer unexpectedness of some of these historical party fouls also contributes to their charm. We have certain expectations of historical figures. Spartans are fierce warriors. Romans are disciplined empire builders. Puritans are deeply religious. To then imagine them fumbling awkwardly in a social setting, to picture a fearsome Viking warrior being perplexed by a particularly tricky piece of dinner etiquette, or a powerful king making a fool of himself at his own feast, creates a delightful cognitive dissonance. It humanizes these often remote and imposing figures, bringing them down to our level, making them seem less like statues in a museum and more like relatable, if occasionally hapless, individuals. The humor often lies in the incongruity, the clash between the expected and the actual. A Spartan at a symposium is a walking, talking anachronism in terms of social behavior, a fish out of water, and the imagined or historically recorded results are inherently comedic. The more serious the historical figure, the funnier their potential social ineptitude becomes. It's the same reason why a very dignified person slipping on a banana peel, a purely hypothetical ancient banana peel of course, is funnier than if it happens to a known clown. One quirky, lesser-known reason for our amusement might be a subtle recognition of the emperor's new clothes syndrome. Many of these ancient social codes and expectations, like the elaborate rituals of a royal court or the rigid rules of a Spartan mess, were based on unquestioned authority and tradition. To see them disrupted by an awkward individual, or to look back on them with modern eyes and see their inherent arbitrariness, can feel a bit like a child pointing out that the emperor is, indeed, wearing no clothes. It's a gentle poke at the pomposity and self-seriousness that can accompany any rigid social structure. It is a subject of ongoing discussion in humor studies and social psychology why certain types of social awkwardness or rule-breaking are perceived as funny. Theories range from superiority theory, we laugh at the misfortunes or ineptitude of others, to incongruity theory, we laugh at the unexpected or the absurd juxtaposition of ideas, to relief theory, laughter as a release of nervous tension. These historical party fouls likely tap into all of these to some extent. Ultimately, these tales of historical social clumsiness offer a gentle, non-threatening way to engage with the past. They are not about grand battles or earth-shattering political changes. They are about the small human moments of everyday life, the relatable struggles of trying to fit in, to make a good impression, to avoid making a fool of oneself, and, in a world that often feels overwhelmingly serious and complex. There's a simple, sleepy pleasure to be found in these light-hearted historical vignettes. They remind us that for all the pomp and circumstance, for all the grand narratives of history, people in the past were still just people, capable of being just as awkward, just as out of place, and just as unintentionally funny as we sometimes are ourselves. And that perhaps is why they still bring a smile to our faces as we drift off into our own, hopefully less socially perilous dreams. The faint, sleepy smiles brought on by those tales of centuries-old social clumsiness and historical party fouls now begin to deepen into a more profound sense of restful appreciation. Our grand historical hangout, our tour through awkward antiquity from stoic Spartan soirees to less-than-merry medieval minstrels and beyond, is drawing to its gentle, doze-inducing close as we prepare to bid farewell to these wonderfully weird and often uncomfortable social gatherings of the past. We might find ourselves reflecting with a touch of gratitude on the evolution of social graces, the usually greater tolerance for minor faux pas in our own time, and perhaps most importantly, the delightful freedom we possess to not invite a famously frugal Spartan, a sternly judgmental Roman senator, or a mood-killing monarch to our next birthday bash. You've journeyed to the stark plains of Laconia, where the Spartans, forged in the brutal Agoge and sustained by the joyless black broth of the Syssitia, were more adept at facing down a Persian phalanx than navigating the subtle currents of an Athenian symposium. Their laconic speech, their disdain for luxury, their narrowly focused worldview, all conspired to make them, however unintentionally, legendary party poopers. You then shifted your gaze to Rome, where even figures as renowned as Cato the Elder could bring a chilling austerity to any convivium with their lectures on declining morals and the evils of imported figs. You crossed the centuries and the ocean to witness the pious potlucks of the Puritans, where spiritual reflection was the main course and mirth was a highly suspicious side dish, best left untouched. You've cringed at the thought of royal ruckuses, where a king's bad temper or political paranoia could turn a magnificent feast into an exercise in extreme anxiety for every unfortunate guest. You've navigated the perilous waters of clashing customs, imagining the epic social misunderstandings that arose when different ancient cultures, with their unique ideas of hospitality and celebration, tried to break bread or fermented mare's milk together. You even considered those truly unwanted attendees, the guests from Hades, the freeloading Greek parasitos, the restless ancestral spirit demanding its share of the offerings, or the capricious deity who might turn you into a newt if the wine wasn't up to scratch. And you've explored the less glamorous side of historical feasting, from the medieval minstrel whose livelihood depended on entertaining a rowdy, often unappreciative, baronial hall, to the profound, prayerful silence of the monastic refectory, a supper club that was decidedly not about the scintillating conversation. As a delightful contrast, you peeked into the Athenian symposium, a vibrant hub of philosophy, poetry, and wine-fueled camaraderie, a testament to the fact that not all ancient parties were doomed to awkwardness. This long, strange trip through historical social etiquette, or the lack thereof, ultimately reminds us of the immense pressure ancient peoples often faced to conform, to perform their social roles correctly, and to navigate a world filled with spoken and unspoken rules, where a minor slip-up could have disproportionate consequences. The fear of shame, of social ostracism, of offending the powerful or the divine, was a constant undercurrent in their lives. The freedom to be casually, individualistically, or eccentrically oneself at a social gathering is a relatively modern luxury for most. This evolution from highly ritualized and status-conscious social interactions to more informal and individualistic styles is a broad theme in the social history of many cultures. One final, quirky thought to drift away on. Consider the sheer effort involved in hosting a successful party in antiquity, especially if your guest list included a Spartan envoy, a Roman moralist, a couple of easily offended local deities, and a professional party crasher. The diplomatic skills required would be immense, It makes modern worries about seating charts and dietary restrictions seem positively trivial. The precise strategies employed by ancient hosts to manage difficult or incompatible guests, beyond simply not inviting them again, are often lost to us, but one imagines a great deal of careful planning, subtle maneuvering, and perhaps a silent prayer to the god of successful social events. As the last echoes of these awkward ancient celebrations fade into the quiet of your room, as the image of a Spartan attempting small talk dissolves into a comfortable darkness, perhaps you can feel a gentle sense of relief. Relief that your own social gatherings are unlikely to be attended by anyone who will judge your choice of wine based on its lack of austerity, or who will deliver a 3-hour sermon on the evils of dancing if the music gets too lively. We can, for the most part, choose our company, and our company can, for the most part, choose to politely decline if they know there'll be a fish out of water. The sounds of ancient revelry, the awkward silences, the stern pronouncements, and the occasional ghostly gatecrasher all now begin to soften and recede, like the last notes of a minstrel's lute fading into the night. The grand halls, the smoky longhouses, the austere refectories, and the lively symposia of bygone eras gently dissolve, leaving behind only the quiet comfort of your own familiar surroundings. This historical hangout, with all its peculiar party, fouls and social anxieties, has served its sleepy purpose. Allow your mind to drift away from the thought of stern Spartans or judgmental Puritans. Let go of the image of the moody monarch or the uninvited deity. Instead, feel the simple, undeniable ease of your own bed, the gentle pressure of your pillow, the steady, even rhythm of your own breathing. The complex social codes of the past, with their potential for epic awkwardness, no longer concern you. Here, in this serene space, there is only the invitation to relax, to let go of all social effort, to simply be. This journey through the more challenging social landscapes of history perhaps leaves you with a quiet appreciation for the ease of modern fellowship, for the general, though not always universal, tolerance for our own minor social imperfections, the immense burden of performing perfectly in every social interaction, lest you offend a god or a king, is a weight most of us no longer carry. And as you rest now, you can do so with a sense of gentle gratitude for that. Imagine all those ancient individuals, after a long day or evening of navigating complex social expectations, finally finding their own moment of release, their own quiet sigh of relief as they retired to their own beds. Let their ancient desire for peace and uncomplicated rest become a soft, lulling presence, a reminder that the need for sanctuary and sleep is a timeless human comfort. Let the memory of their awkward celebrations dissolve into the soothing darkness. Behind your closed eyelids, your breathing deepens, your muscles soften further, and any lingering thoughts of historical party etiquette become as distant and unimportant as a forgotten invitation. The only guest you need to welcome now is sleep itself, and its only demand is your peaceful surrender. Rest now. Drift away on a calm and untroubled current. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.